When the galaxy was young, and the Emperor's vision of unity first took shape across the stars, long before the nightmare of the 41st millennium consumed all hope, the Emperor's children emerged from the genetic laboratories of Terra as perhaps the most perfect expression of transhuman potential ever achieved. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery even to the most learned Adeptus Mechanicus geneters and Imperial historians. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of warriors who achieved mastery over both martial excellence and cultural refinement, when the Imperium itself was nothing more than a dream taking its first breath. The Emperor's children of the Great Crusade era represent the pinnacle attempt to create warriors not merely in the Emperor's image but as living embodiments of his vision for what humanity could become. Unlike the sensation-obsessed degenerates that bear their name in the current age, this bygone era witnessed a flourishing of nobility, artistic achievement and tactical brilliance that reflected the very best aspirations of the species. Archaeological evidence recovered from the ruins of Chemos and fragmentary records preserved in the deepest vaults of Terra place the beginning of this golden age somewhere between the closing decades of the 30th millennium and the opening centuries of the Great Crusade. To understand the magnitude of what was lost when the Emperor's children fell to darkness, one must first comprehend the sheer scope of their original perfection. Where other legions excelled in specific aspects of warfare, the Imperial fists in fortification, the Ultramarines in tactical flexibility, the Space Wolves in savage assault, the Third Legion achieved something far more ambitious. They sought nothing less than absolute mastery in every conceivable aspect of human endeavor. Their warriors were not merely soldiers but artists, philosophers, and craftsmen whose very existence challenged the boundaries of what transhuman potential could achieve. The contrast between their former glory and current damnation serves as perhaps the most tragic cautionary tale in Imperial history. In the grim darkness of the far future, few citizens of the Imperium even remember that the name Emperor's children once stood for everything noble and pure about humanity's expansion among the stars. Those corrupted beings who now bear that title represent such a complete inversion of their original nature that scholars debate whether any trace of their former selves remains, or if the legion that once embodied perfection has been so thoroughly consumed by excess that they exist now as nothing more than a mockery of their own legacy. The scale of this transformation defies easy comprehension. Imagine if the greatest cathedral ever built were suddenly transformed into a den of the most depraved heresies, its soaring spires twisted into blasphemous shapes and its sacred halls echoing with screams rather than hymns. This barely approaches the cosmic tragedy of what befell the Emperor's children. They fell not from mediocrity to corruption, but from the very heights of human achievement to the deepest pits of degradation. Their story serves as a stark reminder that in a galaxy where the dark gods wait eagerly to corrupt the pure, even the most perfect of the Emperor's creations can be led astray. What makes their fall even more poignant is that it was not sudden like a structure collapsing under enemy bombardment, but gradual, like the slow erosion of a mountain by wind and rain. The seeds of their corruption were present from their very inception, hidden within the same drive for perfection that initially made them great. Their pursuit of excellence, noble in its original form, contained within it the potential for the pride and obsession that would ultimately damn them. Understanding this paradox, how their greatest strength became their fatal weakness, requires examining not just what they became, but what they originally were. The Emperor's children before their fall were living proof that humanity could transcend its limitations without losing its essential character. They demonstrated that warriors could be both deadly and refined, that strength could coexist with beauty, and that the pursuit of perfection could elevate rather than corrupt. For nearly 2 centuries they stood as a shining example of what the Great Crusade could achieve, inspiring other legions and proving that the Emperor's vision of human unity and excellence was not merely possible but inevitable. Yet, even in their golden age, careful observers might have noticed certain troubling signs. The same perfectionism that drove them to unprecedented heights also bred an intolerance for failure that bordered on the obsessive. Their pride in their achievements, initially well-deserved, gradually grew into something more dangerous, a belief that they were inherently superior not just to baseline humans, but to their fellow Astartes as well. The very qualities that made them great contained the seeds of something far darker, waiting for the right circumstances to flourish and ultimately consume everything they had built. The genetic laboratories of Terra, during the late Age of Strife, hummed with activity as the Emperor's greatest work neared completion. Within the deepest levels of the imperial palace, shielded by technologies that predated recorded history, the Primarch project represented humanity's most ambitious attempt to transcend the limitations that had confined the species for millennia. Among the 20 gestation chambers that would birth the Emperor's sons, one held particular significance, the vessel that would nurture the being destined to lead the Third Legion, though none could have foreseen the tragic irony that would define his legacy. The environmental conditions of this era shaped everything about the nascent Space Marine legions. Terra itself bore the scars of countless wars, its surface scarred by nuclear bombardment, and its skies choked with the ash of dead civilizations. Yet beneath this devastation, in the climate-controlled sanctums where the Emperor pursued his work, conditions approached the theoretical ideal for genetic manipulation. The psychic barriers protecting these facilities from warp intrusion remained at their strongest. The ancient technologies functioned at peak efficiency, and the Emperor's personal attention ensured that every variable was precisely controlled. Within this carefully maintained environment, the genetic template that would become the Emperor's children began to take shape. The Emperor's vision for this particular legion differed subtly but significantly from his plans for their brothers. Where other legions were designed to excel in specific aspects of warfare for siegecraft, rapid assault, or psychological warfare, the Third Legion was intended to achieve something far more challenging: absolute excellence across every conceivable discipline. Their gene seed was crafted not merely to produce superior warriors, but superior human beings in every sense of the term. The statistical data preserved from this period reveals the extraordinary care devoted to the Third Legion's creation. Their genetic modifications underwent 347% more testing cycles than the average legion, with particular attention paid to the neurological enhancements that would allow rapid mastery of complex skills. The Emperor personally supervised 73 separate revisions to their genetic template, each refinement aimed at eliminating even the smallest imperfection. Resource allocation records show that the Third Legion's development consumed nearly twice the materials of a standard legion creation, with exotic compounds imported from across the Sol system to ensure optimal results. Early manifestations of their destined greatness became apparent even before the first recruits underwent the transformation process. The genetic screening protocols identified candidates who displayed not merely physical prowess and mental resilience, but an almost supernatural capacity for learning and improvement. These early aspirants, drawn primarily from the declining noble houses of Terra, brought with them cultural sophistication that would prove both blessing and curse. They possessed an appreciation for art, music, and literature that other legions often dismissed as irrelevant to warfare. Yet this cultural foundation would later provide the framework for their legion's unique character. The growing signs of the legion's exceptional nature manifested in ways both subtle and profound. Training simulations designed to challenge even enhanced Astartes were completed with margins of success that exceeded all projections. Combat scenarios that typically required months of preparation were mastered in weeks. Perhaps most significantly, the early Emperor's children displayed an insatiable hunger for improvement that went beyond mere ambition. They approached every task, from weapon maintenance to tactical planning, with a perfectionist zeal that impressed even their creators. Yet even in these earliest days, careful observers might have detected the first hints of what would later prove problematic. The aspirants' drive for excellence occasionally manifested as intolerance for the limitations of others. During joint training exercises with other nascent legions, the future Emperor's children sometimes displayed frustration when their brothers failed to match their standards of performance. These incidents were dismissed as growing pains, natural competition between elite units, but they represented the first stirrings of the pride that would eventually consume them. The psychic resonance patterns measured during this period paint a fascinating picture of the legion's developing character. Unlike other legions whose warp signatures reflected specific martial virtues, the Imperial Fist's unwavering determination, the Space Wolves' primal fury, the Emperor's children exhibited something more complex. Their psychic imprint suggested not merely strength or courage, but a deep-seated need for validation and recognition that would prove central to their identity. This resonance pattern, initially interpreted as ambition and drive, contained within it the seeds of vulnerability that chaos would later exploit. The recruitment protocols established during this primordial phase set precedents that would define the legion for centuries. Unlike other legions that drew from specific populations or cultural backgrounds, the Emperor's children selected candidates based on potential rather than origin. This approach yielded extraordinary results in terms of individual capability, but it also created a legion whose identity was built around achievement rather than heritage. Without the cultural anchors that grounded other legions, the Emperor's children would prove susceptible to influences that appealed to their sophisticated tastes and perfectionist tendencies. The formal establishment of the Third Legion coincided with the final phases of the Unification Wars, as the Emperor's forces prepared to extend their reach beyond Terra's poisoned skies. From the carefully selected gene stock of Terra's nobility, and the most promising candidates identified by the Legion's stringent screening protocols, the first companies of Emperor's children began to take shape. Their emergence onto the battlefields of Terra marked not merely the birth of another Space Marine Legion, but the manifestation of the Emperor's most ambitious attempt to create perfect warriors. The early campaigns that blooded the nascent Legion revealed capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. During the siege of the Caucasus fortresses, companies of Emperor's children demonstrated tactical flexibility that allowed them to adapt their strategies in real time, turning defensive positions into offensive opportunities with a fluidity that impressed veteran commanders. The Nordic campaigns saw them employ combined arms tactics with a precision that made their movements appear choreographed, each Marine knowing instinctively how his actions would complement those of his battle brothers. Gradual development of their distinctive combat doctrines began to set them apart from their fellow legions. Where others might rely on overwhelming force or specialized tactics, the Emperor's children pursued what they termed surgical perfection, the elimination of enemies with the minimum expenditure of resources, and the maximum demonstration of skill. This approach yielded remarkable results, with casualty ratios consistently favoring the Third Legion by margins that seemed almost supernatural. Every battle became an opportunity not merely to achieve victory, but to achieve it in the most elegant and efficient manner possible. Key breakthrough moments in their tactical evolution occurred during the liberation of Luna. Faced with enemy positions that had resisted other Imperial forces for months, the Emperor's children analyzed the tactical situation with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. They identified weaknesses that others had missed, exploited timing windows measured in seconds, and coordinated their assault with such precision that the fortress complex fell in less than 6 hours. This victory established their reputation for finding solutions where others saw only insurmountable obstacles. The expanding recognition among other legions came with both admiration and a subtle undercurrent of rivalry. The Imperial Fists respected their tactical acumen, the Ultramarines acknowledged their strategic flexibility, and the Iron Hands appreciated their technical precision. Yet this recognition often carried an edge of competitiveness, as other legions found themselves challenged to match standards that seemed to rise with each Emperor's Children campaign. The Third Legion's pursuit of excellence had begun to create ripple effects throughout the nascent Astartes force structure. Growing reputation among Imperial command elements brought increased responsibility and more challenging assignments. The Emperor's Children found themselves deployed to sectors where other forces had failed, expected to succeed where success had seemed impossible. This pattern of deployment reinforced their self-image as the Legion capable of achieving what others could not, feeding a cycle of rising expectations and increasingly spectacular achievements. Each victory validated their approach and strengthened their conviction that perfection was not merely an aspiration but an achievable goal. Combat doctrines developed during this period emphasized adaptability over specialization. Rather than focusing on a particular type of warfare, the Emperor's Children sought to master every conceivable tactical scenario. They studied the methods of other legions, analyzed historical battles from across human history, and experimented with combinations of strategy and technology that pushed the boundaries of what Space Marines could accomplish. This comprehensive approach to warfare made them invaluable in complex operational environments where multiple skills might be required. The Legion's organizational structure evolved to support their perfectionist philosophy. Companies were structured not around rigid hierarchies but around meritocratic principles that rewarded excellence regardless of seniority. Marines who demonstrated exceptional skill found themselves advanced rapidly, while those who failed to meet the Legion's exacting standards faced intensive retraining or reassignment. This system produced remarkable individual capabilities but also created internal pressure that would later contribute to their vulnerability to corruption. Recognition from Imperial commanders increasingly led to independent operations where the Emperor's Children could operate without the constraints of joint command structures. These solo deployments allowed them to fully implement their tactical preferences and demonstrate their capabilities without compromise. The success of these missions further reinforced their belief in their own superiority and their growing distance from the other legions who might not share their commitment to perfection. The first stirrings of what would become their cultural identity began to manifest during victory celebrations and periods of respite between campaigns. Unlike other legions who might spend such time in weapon practice or physical conditioning, the Emperor's children began to explore artistic and cultural pursuits. They viewed these activities not as distractions from their martial duties but as complementary disciplines that could enhance their overall capabilities. This holistic approach to excellence would become a defining characteristic of the Legion, setting them apart from their more narrowly focused brothers. The documentary evidence preserved in the archives of the Imperial Palace provides unprecedented insight into the Emperor's children's extraordinary capabilities during their ascendant phase. Battle reports from the Proximan Betrayal Campaign, one of their earliest major engagements, describe tactical maneuvers that defied conventional military wisdom. When faced with a rebel alliance that had fortified themselves across 17 separate asteroid installations, the Emperor's children achieved complete victory in 43 hours, using a combination of void warfare, boarding actions, and psychological operations that demonstrated their mastery across multiple combat disciplines simultaneously. The specific incident that first brought them to the Emperor's personal attention occurred during the final assault on the Yersh Confederacy's mountain strongholds. Other Imperial forces had been stalled for months by the complex defensive networks carved into the Himalayan peaks, but the Emperor's children approached the problem with characteristic analytical precision. They identified that the defenders' strength lay not in their fortifications but in their coordination between separate positions. Rather than attempt costly direct assaults, the 3rd Legion executed a series of surgical strikes that disrupted enemy communications while simultaneously creating the illusion of a massive frontal assault elsewhere. The tactical brilliance displayed during this campaign went beyond mere military competence. The Emperor's children demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to predict enemy responses and counter them before the enemies themselves had fully committed to their courses of action. Combat recordings show instances where squads of Emperor's children would alter their formations seconds before enemy fire arrived at positions they had just vacated, as if they possessed prescient knowledge of their opponent's intentions. This uncanny tactical awareness became a hallmark of the Legion and contributed significantly to their growing reputation for invincibility. Reactions from other legions and Imperial forces ranged from admiration to barely concealed envy. The Iron Warriors, themselves masters of siege warfare, found their established doctrines challenged by the Emperor's children's unconventional approaches to fortified positions. The Imperial Fists, renowned for their defensive capabilities, discovered that the 3rd Legion could breach their theoretical fortress designs with tactics that seemed to ignore established principles of siegecraft. These interactions created a complex dynamic within the growing Astartes Brotherhood as the Emperor's children's successes implicitly challenged the specialized excellence that other legions had built their identities around. The escalating complexity of their operational methods reflected their fundamental belief that warfare was an art form rather than merely a practical necessity. Standard Imperial doctrine called for overwhelming force applied at decisive points, but the Emperor's children increasingly favored elaborate strategies that achieved victory through minimal expenditure of resources, while maximizing the demonstration of tactical sophistication. Their battle plans resembled intricate puzzles where every element served multiple purposes, creating redundant paths to victory, while simultaneously showcasing the intellectual superiority of their creators. Early displays of their cultural refinement began to distinguish them from their brother legions in ways that went beyond mere tactical preference. Where other Astartes might spend periods between campaigns in weapon maintenance and physical conditioning, the Emperor's children pursued what they termed comprehensive excellence. They studied art, music, and literature from conquered worlds, analyzing these cultural artifacts with the same intensity they brought to tactical planning. This approach reflected their belief that true perfection required mastery of all human endeavors, not merely those directly related to warfare. The Legion's first artistic achievements during this period established precedents that would define their character for decades. Companies began commissioning victory monuments that served as both tactical training aids and works of aesthetic beauty. Their armor became canvases for intricate designs that reflected individual achievements while maintaining the Legion's visual coherence. Even their weapons received decorative modifications that enhanced both their functional efficiency and their artistic appeal. This integration of beauty with utility became a fundamental aspect of their identity. Recognition by the Emperor himself came during a reviewing ceremony on Terra, where he personally inspected the returning Third Legion forces. Observers noted that the Emperor spent considerably more time examining the Emperor's children than he had with other legions, studying their equipment, questioning their commanders about tactical innovations, and even commenting approvingly on the artistic modifications to their war gear. This imperial attention validated the Legion's approach and reinforced their conviction that they represented something special within the Astartes forces. The dangerous precedent of their growing pride manifested in increasingly elaborate victory celebrations that went beyond the simple ceremonies observed by other legions. The Emperor's children began to view each triumph not merely as a military necessity, but as an opportunity to demonstrate their superiority through the manner of their achievement. They developed rituals around their victories that emphasized the artistic and intellectual aspects of their success, creating ceremonies that bordered on theatrical performances designed to showcase their cultural sophistication alongside their martial prowess. Perhaps most significantly, this period saw the emergence of their belief in their own inherent superiority over baseline humans, and increasingly, over their fellow Astartes. While all Space Marines understood their enhanced nature, the Emperor's children began to interpret their successes as evidence of a fundamental difference that went beyond mere genetic modification. They saw themselves as the natural evolution of humanity, destined to lead not through divine appointment like the Emperor, but through demonstrated excellence that made their leadership inevitable and right. The discovery of Fulgrim on the industrial world of Chemos marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the Emperor's children's true golden age. When the Emperor's gene-crafted son was finally reunited with his legion, the transformation was immediate and profound. Fulgrim embodied everything the Third Legion had aspired to become: a being of such perfect physical beauty and intellectual capability that his very presence seemed to validate their pursuit of excellence. The reunion ceremony itself became a work of art, with the Legion presenting their Primarch with displays of martial prowess and cultural achievement that demonstrated the heights they had reached during his absence. Under Fulgrim's guidance, the Legion's peak achievements during the early Great Crusade surpassed even their own ambitious expectations. The Primarch's influence was not merely tactical but transformational, as he encouraged his sons to pursue excellence in ways they had never previously imagined. Where they had once sought perfection in warfare, Fulgrim challenged them to achieve mastery over every aspect of existence. He established schools within the Legion dedicated to sculpture, music, poetry, and philosophy, arguing that a warrior who could not appreciate beauty was fundamentally incomplete regardless of his battlefield prowess. The technological and artistic mastery methods developed under Fulgrim's leadership created a unique synthesis of practical application and aesthetic achievement. Legion artificers began producing weapons and armor that functioned as masterpieces of engineering while simultaneously serving as works of transcendent beauty. Their forges on Chemos became centers of innovation where the boundaries between technology and art dissolved completely. Bolt weapons were crafted with the precision of musical instruments. Power armor was sculpted with the attention to detail of classical statuary, and vehicles were designed to inspire awe in allies and enemies alike. The organizational structure that emerged under Fulgrim's leadership reflected his philosophy of comprehensive excellence. Traditional company structures were modified to include cultural officers whose responsibilities included maintaining the Legion's artistic standards and ensuring that every action reflected their commitment to perfection. These positions were not ceremonial, but integral to the Legion's function, as these officers worked to ensure that tactical planning incorporated aesthetic considerations and that victory was achieved in ways that reflected the Legion's sophisticated nature. Chemos itself was transformed under the Legion's influence from a declining industrial world into something approaching a work of art. The Primarch and his sons rebuilt the planet's cities according to principles that balanced functional efficiency with stunning beauty. Manufacturing centers became architectural marvels. Residential districts were designed as integrated artistic compositions, and even utilitarian structures like power plants and water treatment facilities were crafted to inspire rather than merely serve. The entire world became a testament to the Emperor's children's belief that excellence in one area should naturally extend to all others. The Legion's philosophy of perfection during this period represented the culmination of their pre-corruption development. They genuinely believed that humanity's destiny lay in the transcendence of all limitations through dedicated effort and refined taste. This was not yet the obsessive pride that would later damn them, but a noble aspiration to elevate the human condition through example and achievement. Their successes during this era seemed to validate this philosophy, as they demonstrated repeatedly that dedication to excellence could indeed produce results that bordered on the miraculous. Cultural and artistic traditions established during this golden age would persist throughout the Legion's existence, even after their fall to chaos, though in increasingly corrupted forms. The practice of creating victory sculptures evolved into elaborate monuments that commemorated not just military success, but the aesthetic manner of its achievement. Musical compositions celebrating battles were performed with instrumental precision that rivaled the tactical execution they commemorated. Poetry commemorating fallen brothers achieved literary merit that would have impressed scholars on any civilized world. These traditions reflected the Legion's genuine belief that warfare could be elevated to an art form without losing its effectiveness. Yet even during this period of unprecedented achievement, subtle vulnerabilities were becoming embedded in the Legion's culture. Their pursuit of perfection, noble in its intentions, began to create expectations that went beyond mere excellence. Fulgrim's own perfectionist nature, initially inspiring, set standards that pushed his sons toward increasingly extreme measures to meet his expectations. The Primarch's casual dismissal of inferior efforts, though intended to encourage greater achievement, began to create internal pressure that would later make the Legion susceptible to influences that promised easier paths to the perfection they craved. The hidden flaws in their pursuit of perfection were not immediately apparent, masked as they were by the Legion's genuine achievements and noble intentions. Their growing intolerance for anything less than excellence gradually extended beyond their own performance to include their expectations of others. Allied forces found themselves subjected to criticism that, while technically accurate, reflected a growing disconnect between the Emperor's children and those they were meant to protect. This emerging arrogance was still subtle, manifesting as constructive criticism and helpful suggestions, but it represented the first steps toward the isolation that would later leave them vulnerable to corruption. The dangerous precedent of seeking validation through achievement rather than duty began during this period, though its implications would not become clear until much later. The Emperor's children increasingly measured their worth through their accomplishments, rather than their service to the Imperium, creating a psychological dependency on success that would prove catastrophic when they encountered challenges that could not be overcome through excellence alone. Their identity became so intertwined with their achievements that any threat to their perfect record became a threat to their very sense of self, setting the stage for the desperate measures that would ultimately damn them. The core philosophy that emerged during the Emperor's Children's expansion across the galaxy represented a sophisticated synthesis of martial excellence and cultural refinement that challenged the established norms of Imperial compliance operations. Rather than simply conquering worlds and imposing Imperial rule through force, the Third Legion developed what they termed elevational conquest, a methodology that sought to uplift conquered populations to appreciate the superior culture and achievements of their new masters. This approach yielded remarkable results in terms of rapid integration and reduced post-compliance resistance, as populations found themselves not merely defeated but genuinely inspired by their conquerors. Successful implementations of this philosophy across multiple campaigns demonstrated the Third Legion's unique capacity to adapt their excellence-based approach to diverse operational environments. The Diasporic's fleet compliance showcased their ability to appreciate and incorporate the artistic achievements of other cultures while maintaining their own superior standards. Rather than destroying the Nomad fleet's cultural artifacts as other legions might have done, the Emperor's children studied them, identified elements worthy of preservation, and integrated the best aspects into their own expanding cultural synthesis. This approach created lasting loyalty among former enemies who found themselves elevated rather than merely subjugated. The reactions from other Primarchs and legions to these methodologies ranged from curious admiration to barely concealed skepticism. Rogel Dorn acknowledged the tactical effectiveness of the Emperor's Children's approach, while questioning whether such elaborate methods were necessary when simpler solutions existed. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands expressed private concerns that his brother Fulgrim's legion was becoming too concerned with appearances at the expense of practical efficiency. These criticisms, though offered in the spirit of brotherhood, began to create subtle tensions that would later contribute to the Emperor's Children's growing sense of isolation from their fellow Astartes. Growing complications with their perfectionist demands began to manifest in their interactions with Imperial Army units and other supporting forces. The Third Legion's standards for equipment maintenance, tactical execution, and even personal presentation exceeded what most baseline humans could consistently achieve. This led to increasing friction as the Emperor's children found themselves constantly disappointed by the performance of forces they deemed insufficiently committed to excellence. Their attempts to elevate these units through training and example often created resentment rather than improvement, as baseline humans struggled to meet standards designed for transhuman capabilities. The expansion of their cultural influence extended far beyond the worlds they conquered to encompass other Imperial forces, Mechanicum affiliates, and even civilian populations across multiple sectors. Emperor's children veterans returning to Terra brought with them artistic styles, philosophical concepts, and cultural practices gathered from across the galaxy, creating a renaissance of sorts within Imperial high society. Noble houses began commissioning artworks in the style favored by the Third Legion. Military academies incorporated their tactical innovations into standard curricula, and even civilian architecture began to reflect their aesthetic principles. The Legion's growing reputation for cultural sophistication attracted a following among Imperial intellectuals and artists, who saw in the Emperor's children a validation of their belief that human civilization could transcend its current limitations. Remembrancers assigned to the Third Legion produced works of unprecedented quality, inspired by their exposure to a military force that valued artistic achievement as highly as martial prowess. These cultural ambassadors spread the Legion's influence far beyond their direct area of operations, creating a network of admirers and imitators that extended the Emperor's children's reach throughout the expanding Imperium. The dangerous precedent of cultural superiority began to manifest in the Legion's interactions with populations that failed to meet their aesthetic and intellectual standards. Worlds with cultures the Emperor's children deemed primitive or unsophisticated found themselves subjected to more intensive elevation programs that bordered on cultural imperialism. While these efforts were genuinely intended to improve the lives of conquered populations, they reflected a growing assumption that the Third Legion's cultural preferences represented universal standards rather than personal choices. This attitude would later make them susceptible to influences that promised to reveal even higher levels of cultural and aesthetic achievement. The first signs of friction with more pragmatic legions became apparent during joint operations, where different tactical philosophies came into direct conflict. The Iron Warrior's preference for overwhelming firepower clashed with the Emperor's children's desire for elegant solutions, leading to heated debates about the proper balance between effectiveness and artistry in warfare. The Space Wolves' straightforward approach to combat struck the Third Legion as unnecessarily crude, while their own elaborate tactical displays were dismissed by Lamin Russ's sons as pointless showmanship. These philosophical differences, initially minor, began to create lasting divisions within the Astartes Brotherhood. The Legion's expanding influence created unexpected vulnerabilities, as their reputation for cultural sophistication attracted the attention of Xenos races and human cultures with their own artistic traditions. The Layer civilization in particular would later prove instrumental in the Legion's downfall. But even during this period, their encounters with alien aesthetic concepts began to challenge their assumptions about the nature of perfection and beauty. The Emperor's children's openness to new forms of artistic expression, initially a strength that allowed them to incorporate the best elements of conquered cultures, became a weakness when they encountered influences specifically designed to corrupt rather than elevate. The growing distance between the Emperor's children and other Imperial forces reflected their increasing belief that their approach to warfare and culture represented not merely one valid methodology among many, but the inevitable evolution of human military and cultural development. They began to view criticism of their methods not as legitimate tactical disagreement, but as evidence of intellectual and cultural limitation on the part of their critics. This attitude fostered an insularity that would later leave them vulnerable to influences that promised to validate their sense of superiority, while leading them away from the imperial truth they had sworn to defend. The earliest manifestations of what would later be recognized as spiritual corruption appeared so gradually and subtly that even the most observant members of the Third Legion failed to recognize them as warning signs. What began as minor changes in priorities and aesthetic preferences seemed, at the time, to represent natural evolution in their pursuit of perfection rather than the first steps toward damnation. The Legion's increasing fascination with exotic art forms, particularly those recovered from recently conquered Xenos civilizations, appeared to be nothing more than scholarly curiosity combined with their established commitment to cultural excellence. The growing frequency of what they termed artistic excesses initially manifested as extended contemplation sessions, where entire companies would spend hours analyzing recovered artwork, musical compositions, or architectural designs from conquered worlds. These activities were rationalized as tactical research, ways of understanding defeated enemies through their cultural expressions. But the time and attention devoted to such pursuits began to exceed any reasonable military necessity. Battle brothers who had once spent their rest periods maintaining weapons or reviewing tactical data increasingly devoted themselves to aesthetic contemplation that bordered on obsession. The influence of conquered cultures on Legion practices became apparent in subtle modifications to their equipment, ceremonial protocols, and even combat doctrines. Decorative elements from the lair civilization began appearing on Emperor's Children armor and weapons, initially justified as practical improvements that enhanced both function and beauty. These modifications were so skillfully integrated that they appeared to be natural extensions of the Legion's existing aesthetic principles rather than foreign influences. The craftsmanship required to achieve such integration was extraordinary, but the time and effort devoted to these projects began to exceed what their military duties should have permitted. Failed explanations and rationalizations from the Legion's leadership reflected their genuine inability to recognize the nature of the changes occurring within their ranks. When questioned by other Primarchs or Imperial observers about their increasing devotion to cultural pursuits, Fulgrim and his captains provided responses that seemed perfectly reasonable within the context of their established philosophy. They argued that understanding conquered cultures was essential for effective governance, that aesthetic appreciation enhanced tactical awareness, and that their pursuit of excellence naturally extended to all aspects of human endeavor. These explanations satisfied most questioners while masking the deeper transformations taking place. The subtle changes in behavior patterns extended beyond artistic appreciation to encompass alterations in combat preference that would not become fully apparent until much later. The Emperor's Children began to favor tactics that maximized the aesthetic impact of their victories, rather than simply achieving the most efficient resolution of conflicts. They increasingly sought battles that would provide opportunities to demonstrate their superior capabilities in dramatic fashion, sometimes prolonging conflicts unnecessarily to create more impressive displays of martial artistry. These preferences were justified as morale-building exercises that inspired allied forces and intimidated enemies. Clues to the underlying spiritual corruption could be found in the Legion's changing relationship with pain and sensation during this period. While all Space Marines were conditioned to endure pain as a necessary aspect of their duties, the Emperor's Children began to display an unusual interest in the experience itself. They developed training regimens that emphasized sensation and awareness, arguing that enhanced sensory perception improved tactical performance. This interest in heightened experience was initially indistinguishable from their established pursuit of excellence, but it represented the first stirrings of the obsessions that would later consume them. The growing sophistication of their victory celebrations reflected changes in the Legion's fundamental relationship with their achievements. What had once been simple ceremonies acknowledging successful missions evolved into elaborate productions that emphasized the aesthetic and cultural significance of their victories. These celebrations began to incorporate elements from conquered cultures, creating synthesized rituals that blended imperial traditions with foreign influences in ways that seemed natural and even inspiring to participants. The time and resources devoted to these events began to rival those allocated to actual military operations. The Legion's leadership, including Fulgrim himself, displayed increasing preoccupation with achieving ever greater levels of perfection that went beyond military excellence to encompass personal transcendence. The Primarch began speaking of the possibility of achieving states of existence that surpassed even the enhanced capabilities of the Astartes, describing visions of perfection that could only be attained through complete dedication to the pursuit of excellence in all its forms. These aspirations seemed noble and inspiring, but they reflected a dangerous shift from serving the Imperium to serving abstract ideals that could be manipulated by malevolent influences. Perhaps most significantly, the Emperor's Children began to develop an increasing tolerance for ideas and practices that previous generations of the Legion would have rejected as incompatible with Imperial doctrine. Their exposure to diverse cultures, and their commitment to understanding all forms of human and Xenos achievement, led them to adopt a relativistic approach to moral and ethical questions that undermined their connection to the absolute truths that had previously anchored their identity. They began to view imperial doctrine not as eternal truth but as one valid perspective among many, opening the door to influences that would later exploit this philosophical flexibility. The dangerous isolation that resulted from these gradual changes was masked by the Legion's continued military success and their growing reputation throughout the Imperium. Other forces continued to request their assistance. Conquered populations continued to respond positively to their governance methods, and their achievements continued to exceed all reasonable expectations. This success validated their evolving practices and made it impossible for outside observers to recognize the spiritual corruption that was slowly consuming the Legion from within. The Emperor's children had begun their fall while still at the height of their apparent glory, making their eventual damnation all the more tragic and complete. The nature of the new threat that began to manifest within the Emperor's children during this period differed fundamentally from any external enemy they had previously encountered. Unlike the Xenos races, heretical human civilizations, or even the occasional warp-spawned entities that the Great Crusade had faced, this danger emerged from within the Legion's own pursuit of excellence. What made it particularly insidious was that it presented itself not as an opposition to their established values but as their ultimate fulfillment. The corruption that began to take hold offered the promise of achieving the perfection they had always sought, but through means that subtly diverged from the imperial path they had sworn to follow. The first confrontations with those who noticed the changes were handled with the characteristic sophistication that had become the Legion's hallmark. When Ferrus Manus privately expressed concerns about his brother Fulgrim's increasing preoccupation with aesthetic matters, the Primarch of the Third Legion responded with eloquent arguments about the necessity of cultural understanding and effective governance. When Iron Hands veterans questioned certain tactical decisions that seemed to prioritize dramatic effect over practical efficiency, Emperor's Children officers provided detailed explanations that demonstrated how their methods achieved superior long-term results through enhanced morale and psychological impact on both allies and enemies. The escalating conflict between their pursuit of perfection and their duty to the Imperium manifested in increasingly subtle but significant ways. Compliance operations began to take longer than necessary, as the Emperor's children devoted time to studying and cataloging the cultural achievements of conquered civilizations. Resources that should have been allocated to military necessities were instead directed toward preserving and analyzing artistic works that commanders deemed essential to understanding their new subjects. These activities were always justified through reference to established imperial doctrine regarding the importance of cultural integration, but the emphasis had shifted from practical governance to aesthetic appreciation. Desperate measures to maintain their image of purity became necessary as the gap between their evolving practices and orthodox imperial doctrine continued to widen. The Legion's remembrancers and cultural officers worked overtime to craft narratives that presented their activities in the most favorable light possible, emphasizing the practical benefits of their approach while minimizing aspects that might raise questions among less sophisticated observers. Combat reports were carefully edited to highlight tactical innovations while downplaying the increasingly elaborate nature of their methods and the growing time devoted to non-military pursuits. The growing influence of what would later be recognized as Slanesh manifested through the Legion's engagement with artistic and cultural traditions that emphasized sensory experience and aesthetic transcendence. Practices adopted from conquered civilizations, particularly those with sophisticated artistic traditions, began to influence the Emperor's children in ways that went beyond mere cultural appreciation. Meditation techniques that promised enhanced awareness, artistic methods that sought to capture perfect beauty, and philosophical frameworks that elevated sensation to spiritual significance all found their way into Legion doctrine through seemingly innocent cultural exchange programs. The first instances of truly ritualistic behavior appeared during this period, though they were carefully disguised as enhanced training regimens or cultural observances. Companies began conducting ceremonies before major engagements that involved elaborate preparations designed to achieve optimal mental and physical states for combat. These rituals incorporated elements from various conquered cultures, creating syncretic practices that seemed to enhance the Legion's effectiveness while subtly altering their spiritual orientation. The participants experienced genuine improvements in focus and capability, which validated the practices and encouraged their expansion throughout the Legion. Conflicts with the Iron Hands over fundamental methodology became increasingly frequent and intense as the philosophical differences between the two legions grew more pronounced. Where Pharasmanos's sons valued pragmatic efficiency and technological excellence, the Emperor's children increasingly emphasized aesthetic achievement and sensory refinement. Joint operations became exercises in frustration as each legion found the other's methods not merely different but actively counterproductive to their own objectives. These conflicts were typically resolved through careful diplomacy, but they left lasting tensions that would later prove significant during the events of the Horus Heresy. The corruption spreading through the ranks was facilitated by the legion's established culture of excellence and innovation, which made them receptive to any practice that promised improved performance or enhanced capabilities. Battle brothers who might have rejected obviously heretical influences found themselves gradually accepting practices that appeared to be natural extensions of their existing commitment to perfection. The changes were so gradual and seemingly beneficial that even the most loyal and orthodox members of the Legion failed to recognize them as corruption until it was far too late to reverse course. Changes in recruitment and training practices reflected the Legion's evolving priorities and values in ways that would have profound long-term consequences. New aspirants were selected not merely for their physical and mental capabilities, but for their aesthetic sensibility and cultural sophistication. Training regimens began to incorporate artistic and sensory education alongside traditional martial disciplines, creating Astartes who were as devoted to cultural achievement as they were to military excellence. These modifications were presented as improvements to the selection and training process, but they fundamentally altered the character of new Legion members in ways that made them more susceptible to the influences that were slowly consuming their brothers. The dangerous precedent of prioritizing personal transcendence over service to the Imperium became increasingly apparent in the Legion's rhetoric and decision-making processes. Fulgrim and his captains began speaking of their duty to achieve the highest possible levels of human development, arguing that this pursuit ultimately served the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. This subtle shift from serving the Imperium to serving abstract ideals of perfection created a philosophical foundation that could be exploited by malevolent influences promising even greater achievements. The Emperor's children remained convinced of their loyalty and righteousness even as they began to drift away from the anchoring truths that had previously defined their identity and purpose. The abandonment of established imperial principles began as a series of seemingly minor modifications to standard doctrine, each justified by the extraordinary circumstances the Emperor's children faced in their pursuit of ever greater perfection. Traditional Astartes training methods, while effective for producing capable warriors, were deemed insufficient for creating the transcendent beings that Fulgrim envisioned his sons becoming. The Legion's leaders argued that exceptional goals required exceptional methods, and that adherence to conventional limitations would prevent them from achieving their true potential. These arguments seemed reasonable within the context of their established culture, but they represented the first steps toward abandoning the safeguards that had previously protected them from corruption. The dangerous experiments with Xenos technology and artifacts began innocuously enough, framed as research necessary for understanding and countering alien threats. Recovered layer weapons and artistic implements were subjected to exhaustive analysis that went far beyond standard Imperial protocol for handling Xenos materials. Rather than simply studying their function and destroying them, the Emperor's children began to experiment with integration and modification, seeking to understand how alien aesthetic principles might enhance their own achievements. The Primarch himself took personal interest in a particular layer sword that seemed to embody perfect craftsmanship, spending hours examining its construction and testing its capabilities. The new methods developed during this period pushed the boundaries of what Space Marine physiology and psychology could endure while promising unprecedented levels of sensory awareness and aesthetic appreciation. Training regimens were modified to include techniques borrowed from conquered cultures, particularly those that emphasized heightened consciousness and expanded perception. These practices were presented as enhancements to existing capabilities rather than fundamental alterations to Astartes' nature, but they began to change the Legion in ways that went far beyond simple improvement. Marines who underwent these new training methods reported enhanced awareness and improved performance, but they also displayed subtle changes in behavior and priorities that would later prove significant. The unintended consequences of these innovations began to manifest in ways that the Legion's leadership either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. Battle brothers who had undergone the enhanced training regimens displayed increasing preoccupation with sensory experience and aesthetic achievement at the expense of practical concerns. Their combat performance remained exemplary, but their motivations began to shift from duty and honor toward personal satisfaction and transcendent experience. These changes were gradual enough that they appeared to be natural evolution rather than corruption, but they represented fundamental alterations to the spiritual and psychological foundations of the Legion. The point of no return came not through a single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of countless small compromises that individually seemed reasonable, but collectively led the Legion away from the Imperial path. Each modification to established doctrine was justified by the success of previous innovations, creating a momentum that carried them steadily toward damnation without any single moment where they consciously chose to abandon their loyalties. The Emperor's children became increasingly committed to their evolving practices precisely because they appeared to be working, delivering the enhanced capabilities and transcendent experiences that had been promised. Fulgrim's personal transformation during this period served as both catalyst and symbol for the changes occurring throughout the Legion. The Primarch's growing obsession with the Lair Sword reflected his broader evolution from a being dedicated to serving the Emperor's vision to one pursuing his own conception of perfection. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he spent more time in contemplation and experimentation, seeking new ways to transcend the limitations that he increasingly viewed as arbitrary constraints on his development. The Primarch's changes influenced the entire Legion hierarchy, as his captains and champions sought to emulate their father's pursuit of transcendence. The integration of forbidden knowledge and practices accelerated during this period as the Legion's resistance to corruption weakened through repeated exposure to influences that promised ever greater achievements. Philosophical concepts from conquered civilizations that would previously have been rejected as incompatible with imperial doctrine were now seriously considered and often adopted after modification to fit the Legion's evolving worldview. The Emperor's children convinced themselves that they were strong enough to safely incorporate these influences while avoiding their negative aspects, a hubris that made them increasingly vulnerable to manipulation by malevolent powers. The Legion's growing isolation from their brother Astartes reflected their increasing conviction that their methods and achievements placed them on a different level from other imperial forces. They began to view criticism of their innovations as evidence of intellectual and spiritual limitation rather than legitimate concern for their welfare. This isolation was both self-imposed and externally reinforced, as other legions found it increasingly difficult to work effectively with forces whose priorities and methods had diverged so significantly from established norms. The Emperor's children interpreted this isolation as validation of their superior development rather than warning of their corruption. The moment when they crossed the line from innovation to heresy was so subtle that it passed unnoticed by the participants themselves. The adoption of practices and beliefs that were fundamentally incompatible with imperial doctrine occurred gradually enough that each step seemed like a natural progression from previous positions. The Emperor's children maintained their conviction that they remained loyal to the Emperor's vision, even as they pursued goals and employed methods that directly contradicted the principles he had established. Their ability to rationalize these contradictions reflected the depth of their corruption and the skill of the influences that had begun to guide their development. The psychological foundation for their eventual fall to chaos was established during this period through the systematic erosion of their connection to the absolute truths that had previously anchored their identity. Their pursuit of perfection, originally grounded in service to the Emperor and the Imperium, became an end in itself that could be achieved through any means that proved effective. This shift from principled pursuit of excellence to pragmatic achievement of results created the spiritual vacuum that chaos would later fill, promising the Emperor's children the ultimate fulfillment of their desires while leading them completely away from the path they had sworn to follow. The origins of the internal threat that would ultimately consume the Emperor's children can be traced to Horus's carefully orchestrated campaign to recruit his brother Primarchs to his cause. During the early stages of what would become known as the Horus Heresy, the War Master's approach to Fulgrim was particularly sophisticated, exploiting the Third Legion's existing vulnerabilities while appealing to their deepest aspirations and fears. Rather than presenting rebellion as a rejection of the Emperor's vision, Horus framed his cause as its ultimate fulfillment, arguing that the Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade represented an abandonment of the ideals that had made the Imperium great. The turning point when longtime allies became bitter enemies occurred not through dramatic confrontation, but through a series of philosophical discussions that gradually shifted Fulgrim's perspective on the nature of loyalty and duty. Horus presented evidence, both genuine and manufactured, that suggested the Emperor intended to abandon the Primarchs and their legions once the Great Crusade was complete. This information resonated powerfully with Fulgrim's existing concerns about his legion's future and their relationship with their creator. The War Master skillfully argued that true loyalty required protecting the ideals of the Imperium even if it meant opposing the Emperor himself when he strayed from those principles. The spreading corruption through the Legion's command structure was facilitated by the philosophical framework that Horus had provided, which made rebellion appear to be the highest form of loyalty. Fulgrim returned to his Legion with new certainties about their destiny and their duty to preserve the true vision of human perfection against those who would corrupt or abandon it. His captains and champions, already predisposed to follow their Primarch's example and having undergone their own spiritual and philosophical evolution, found these arguments compelling and persuasive. The corruption spread through the command hierarchy with surprising speed, as officers who had been prepared by years of gradual changes readily embraced the new direction. The process by which dedicated servants of the Emperor became willing traitors represented one of the most tragic aspects of the Legion's fall. These were warriors who had served with distinction for decades, who had genuinely believed in the righteousness of their cause and the nobility of their mission. Their transformation into rebels occurred not through coercion or corruption in any obvious sense, but through the gradual redefinition of loyalty itself. They convinced themselves that their rebellion represented the ultimate expression of their dedication to the Emperor's true vision, even as they prepared to take up arms against him and his loyal servants. The final realization of the disaster's scope came gradually as reports filtered in from across the galaxy of other legions declaring their allegiance to Horus and turning against Imperial forces. For many within the Emperor's children, this was the moment when the abstract philosophical justifications for their actions confronted the brutal reality of civil war. The grand rhetoric about preserving the Emperor's vision gave way to the practical necessity of fighting and killing fellow Astartes who remained loyal to the throne. Some within the Legion experienced moments of doubt and horror at what they had committed themselves to. But by this point, the momentum of their choices had carried them too far to turn back. The purging of loyalist elements within the Legion represented the point where philosophical disagreement became active persecution and murder. Those members of the Emperor's children who remained steadfast in their loyalty to the Emperor found themselves suddenly transformed from respected brothers into dangerous enemies who threatened the Legion's new unity of purpose. The elimination of these loyalists was carried out with the same perfectionist attention to detail that the Legion brought to all their endeavors, making it thorough and devastating. The cultural and aesthetic sensibilities that had once been applied to creating beauty were now turned toward the efficient and elegant elimination of internal opposition. Fulgrim's personal role in orchestrating this betrayal reflected the complete transformation of his character and priorities. The Primarch, who had once embodied the highest aspirations of human culture and refinement, now demonstrated a ruthless pragmatism that prioritized the Legion's survival and success over any moral considerations. His ability to rationalize these actions as necessary for the greater good revealed the depth of his spiritual corruption and the skill with which chaos had manipulated his noble impulses. The Primarch's transformation served as both catalyst and justification for the changes occurring throughout the Legion. The internal mechanisms by which the Legion justified its betrayal revealed the sophisticated nature of the corruption that had taken hold. Rather than simply abandoning their previous values, the Emperor's children reinterpreted them in ways that made their rebellion appear to be their natural fulfillment. Their pursuit of perfection now meant perfecting humanity's development beyond the limitations imposed by imperial doctrine. Their dedication to excellence now meant excelling at whatever was necessary to achieve their goals regardless of conventional moral restrictions. Their cultural sophistication now meant transcending primitive notions of simple loyalty in favor of more complex and nuanced understanding of duty and obligation. The speed with which the transformation occurred once it began in earnest reflected both the thoroughness of the preparation that had preceded it and the vulnerability that the Legion's previous evolution had created. Years of gradual changes had weakened their connection to orthodox imperial doctrine while strengthening their commitment to abstract ideals that could be redefined to serve any purpose. When the moment came to choose between their loyalty to the Emperor and their loyalty to their own conception of perfection, the choice seemed obvious and inevitable to warriors who had been carefully prepared to make exactly that decision. The tragic irony of their fall lay in the fact that the Emperor's children believed themselves to be serving a higher purpose even as they betrayed everything they had once held sacred. Their corruption was so complete that they could not recognize their own damnation, instead viewing their rebellion as evidence of their spiritual evolution and moral development. This self-deception made their fall particularly devastating, because it eliminated any possibility of redemption through recognition of their error. They had become too perfect in their corruption to acknowledge that they had fallen at all. The military infrastructure that had made the Emperor's children one of the most effective fighting forces in the galaxy rapidly adapted to serve their new masters and priorities, with the same efficiency that had characterized their previous service to the Imperium. Command structures were reorganized to eliminate potential sources of dissent while maintaining operational effectiveness. Communication networks were purged of loyalist sympathizers and reprogrammed to disseminate the new ideological framework that justified their rebellion. Supply chains were redirected to support operations against Imperial forces rather than expanding the Emperor's domain, a transition that occurred with disturbing smoothness given the magnitude of the betrayal involved. The systematic retreat from Imperial ideals and practices began immediately following the Legion's commitment to Horus's cause, but it was presented as advancement rather than abandonment. Traditional Imperial doctrine was reframed as primitive and limiting, unsuited to the transcendent beings that the Emperor's children had become through their pursuit of perfection. The rigid hierarchies and standardized procedures that had previously governed their operations were replaced with more flexible arrangements that emphasized individual excellence and creative innovation over conformity to established norms. These changes were welcomed by many within the Legion who had long chafed at what they now saw as arbitrary restrictions on their development. The unity that had once characterized the Legion began to dissolve as different factions emerged, each embracing particular aspects of their newfound freedom from Imperial constraints. Some companies focused on perfecting their combat capabilities through methods that would have been forbidden under Orthodox doctrine. Others dedicated themselves to exploring the aesthetic and cultural possibilities opened by their liberation from traditional limitations. Still others pursued philosophical and spiritual development that led them into territories that previous generations of Emperor's children would have recognized as dangerous. These divisions were initially viewed as healthy specialization rather than dangerous fragmentation. The final desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of honor and nobility reflected the difficulty that many within the Legion experienced in completely abandoning the values that had defined their identity for so long. Veteran Marines who had served since the early days of the Great Crusade struggled to reconcile their new allegiances with the oaths they had sworn and the comrades they had lost in service to the Emperor. These internal conflicts were typically resolved through elaborate rationalizations that redefined honor and nobility in ways that accommodated their changed circumstances. But the psychological strain was evident in the increasing intensity with which they pursued their new goals. The complete transformation of the Legion's character accelerated as external pressure from loyalist forces and internal momentum toward ever greater extremes combined to push them further from their origins. Combat operations against former allies required psychological adaptation that would have been impossible for the original Emperor's children, necessitating fundamental changes in how they understood themselves and their purpose. The necessity of fighting and killing fellow Astartes demanded a hardening of hearts and a closing of minds that eliminated the last vestiges of their former compassion and openness to different perspectives. Changes in recruitment and training doctrine reflected the Legion's evolving understanding of what they needed to become in order to survive and thrive in their new circumstances. New aspirants were selected not merely for their potential to become perfect warriors, but for their capacity to embrace the philosophical framework that justified the Legion's rebellion. Training regimens were modified to include ideological conditioning alongside traditional martial disciplines, ensuring that new members would be properly prepared for the realities of their service. These changes represented a complete break with previous practice and a commitment to creating fundamentally different kinds of warriors. The purges of remaining loyalist elements became increasingly sophisticated and thorough, as the Legion developed more effective methods for identifying and eliminating potential sources of opposition. What had initially been crude elimination of obvious dissidents evolved into subtle psychological assessment and gradual conversion or removal of those whose loyalty remained questionable. The cultural and aesthetic sensibilities that had once been devoted to creating beauty were now applied to the artful identification and elegant elimination of internal threats, representing a complete perversion of the Legion's original values. New alliances with other traitor forces created opportunities for the Emperor's children to expand their influence and learn from the experiences of their fellow rebels. But these relationships also accelerated their departure from orthodox imperial practice. Exposure to the methods and philosophies of other traitor legions provided new models for how former servants of the Emperor could adapt to their changed circumstances. The Iron Warrior's pragmatic brutality, the Word-Bearer's religious fervor, and the Night Lord's embrace of terror tactics all offered lessons that the Emperor's children incorporated into their own evolving identity. The complete abandonment of imperial values occurred gradually enough that each step seemed reasonable and necessary, within the context of their immediate circumstances. But the cumulative effect was the total transformation of everything the Legion had once represented. Concepts like duty, honor, loyalty, and sacrifice were systematically redefined until they meant the opposite of their original significance. This process was so thorough that by its completion the Emperor's children had become incapable of recognizing their own fall or understanding what they had lost in their pursuit of what they believed to be perfection. The birth of what they would ultimately become was evident in the emerging patterns of behavior and belief that would later characterize their service to chaos. The obsession with sensation and experience that would define their relationship with Slaanesh was already apparent in their increasing focus on the intensity of their experiences rather than their moral or practical value. The pursuit of perfection that had once driven them toward genuine excellence now drove them toward extremes that previous generations would have recognized as madness. The transformation was so complete that by the end of this period, the Emperor's children existed in name only, their true nature having been replaced by something fundamentally alien to their original character and purpose. The build-up to the final confrontation that would forever seal the Emperor's children's fate began with the virus bombing of Istvan III, an atrocity that demonstrated the complete moral transformation of the Legion and their willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve their objectives. The planning stages for this operation revealed the sophisticated coordination between the traitor forces and their shared commitment to eliminating any remaining loyalty within their ranks. For the Emperor's children, this represented the ultimate test of their dedication to their new path, requiring them to participate in the mass murder of their own brothers who had remained faithful to the Emperor and the Imperial cause. The detailed account of their betrayal of Imperial forces during the Istvan III massacre revealed capabilities that had been perverted from their original noble purposes into instruments of unprecedented treachery. The same tactical brilliance that had once made them exemplary servants of the Emperor now enabled them to orchestrate the destruction of loyalist forces with devastating efficiency. Companies that had once prided themselves on protecting human life now applied their expertise to maximizing casualties among their former brothers. The precision and artistry they brought to this slaughter represented the complete corruption of every virtue they had once possessed. The virus bombing itself demonstrated the Emperor's children's willingness to abandon even the pretense of honorable warfare in pursuit of their goals. The weapon used against the loyalist forces was designed to cause maximum suffering while ensuring complete elimination of opposition, reflecting a calculated cruelty that would have been inconceivable to previous generations of the Legion. The Emperor's children participated in this atrocity not as reluctant tools of their Primarch's will but as enthusiastic architects of devastation who had come to view such actions as necessary expressions of their evolved understanding of perfection and efficiency. The key turning points that determined the battle's outcome revealed how thoroughly the Emperor's children had adapted to their new role as servants of chaos rather than defenders of humanity. When loyalist forces managed to establish defensive positions despite the initial virus attack, the traitor Legion responded with tactics that demonstrated complete disregard for conventional military ethics or imperial doctrine. They employed psychological warfare, targeted civilian populations, and utilized forbidden technologies with a creativity and enthusiasm that shocked even their traitor allies. Each decision point in the battle saw them choose the path that maximized damage and suffering rather than pursuing mere tactical advantage. Combat alongside other traitor legions during the massacre provided the Emperor's children with opportunities to learn from and contribute to new methodologies of warfare that prioritized terror and domination over the efficient achievement of strategic objectives. Their interactions with the World Eaters revealed possibilities for incorporating Berserker Fury into their own tactical doctrine, while cooperation with the Death Guard introduced them to concepts of endurance and attrition that could complement their own pursuit of perfectionist extremes. These exchanges accelerated their transformation and provided models for future development. The moment their transformation became irreversible occurred not during the virus bombing itself but in the aftermath, when surviving loyalist forces emerged from the underground shelters where they had sought refuge from the viral attack. The Emperor's children had the opportunity to offer quarter to these survivors, many of whom were Marines they had served alongside for decades, but instead chose to hunt them down with methodical precision. This decision eliminated any possibility of redemption and demonstrated their complete commitment to their new identity as enemies of everything they had once served. How the battle ended and its immediate aftermath revealed the full scope of what the Emperor's children had become and what they had sacrificed in their pursuit of what they believed to be perfection. The systematic execution of Loyalist survivors was conducted with the same attention to aesthetic detail that had once characterized their pursuit of cultural excellence. They transformed the massacre into a work of art, creating elaborate displays of death and suffering that reflected their evolving understanding of beauty and achievement. The care and creativity they devoted to these atrocities demonstrated how completely their values had been inverted. The birth of their new identity as servants of Slaanesh became fully apparent during the final phases of the battle, as individual Marines and entire companies began displaying behaviors that would have been immediately recognizable as demonic corruption to any orthodox Imperial observer. The pursuit of intense experience that had begun as enhanced sensory awareness during training now manifested as addiction to the sensations of violence and domination. The perfectionist drive that had once motivated genuine excellence now compelled them toward ever greater extremes of cruelty and excess in their treatment of defeated enemies. Fulgrim's personal role in the massacre reflected his complete transformation from a being dedicated to elevating humanity into something that actively sought to debase and corrupt it. The Primarch took personal pleasure in the destruction of Loyalist forces, treating each phase of the operation as an opportunity to demonstrate his evolved understanding of perfection and beauty. His behavior during the battle provided a model for his sons and established precedents for future operations that would prioritize the achievement of intense experience over practical military objectives. The psychological impact of the massacre on the Emperor's children themselves was profound, but largely positive from their corrupted perspective, as it validated their belief that they had transcended the limitations that had previously constrained their development. The successful elimination of Loyalist opposition within their ranks removed the last internal barrier to their complete transformation and eliminated any possibility of future doubt or hesitation about their chosen path. They interpreted their victory not as evidence of their corruption, but as proof of their evolution beyond the primitive constraints that governed lesser beings. The immediate aftermath of Istvan III saw the Emperor's children begin developing the practices and philosophies that would characterize their service to chaos for millennia to come. The intense experiences generated by the massacre became a template for future operations, establishing patterns of behavior that prioritized the achievement of transcendent sensation over traditional military objectives. They had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, transforming themselves from protectors of humanity into predators who viewed human suffering as raw material for their artistic and spiritual development. The confusion and disorder that followed the Emperor's children's complete fall created a complex operational environment where traditional military hierarchies struggled to adapt to their new reality as servants of chaos rather than defenders of the Imperium. Command structures that had been designed to facilitate the efficient prosecution of the Great Crusade now required fundamental reorganization to support operations against their former allies and masters. The transition was complicated by the need to integrate new philosophical frameworks and tactical doctrines while maintaining operational effectiveness in an increasingly hostile galaxy where former friends had become implacable enemies. The various elements of the Legion adapted to their corruption in ways that reflected both their individual personalities and their previous specializations within the Imperial force structure. Companies that had previously focused on cultural and artistic pursuits now applied their aesthetic sensibilities to the creation of elaborate tortures and psychological operations designed to break the will of their enemies. Technical specialists redirected their expertise toward developing new weapons and tactics that prioritized the infliction of suffering over simple battlefield effectiveness. Command elements began incorporating ritualistic practices into their decision-making processes that would have been incomprehensible to their previous incarnations. The struggle to define their new identity as servants of Slaanesh created internal tensions and philosophical debates that sometimes erupted into open conflict between different factions within the Legion. Some embraced the pursuit of intense sensation through physical experience, developing combat doctrines that prioritize close combat and personal involvement in violence. Others focused on psychological and emotional extremes, becoming specialists in terror tactics and mental domination. Still others pursued aesthetic perfection through increasingly elaborate and horrific artistic expressions that incorporated their enemies as unwilling participants in their creative vision. The unexpected consequences of their choices began to manifest in ways that even their corrupted perspectives found challenging to accommodate. The pursuit of perfect experience through increasingly extreme methods created addictive cycles that demanded ever greater stimulation to achieve satisfaction. Warriors who had once been motivated by duty and honor now required constant novelty and intensity to maintain their effectiveness, creating logistical and operational challenges that traditional military doctrine had never anticipated. The Legion's efficiency began to suffer as more resources were diverted towards satisfying these psychological requirements. New dangers emerged from their transformation that threatened not only their enemies, but the Emperor's children themselves, as their pursuit of transcendent experience occasionally produced results that exceeded their ability to control or comprehend. Exposure to warp entities and chaos influences created unpredictable mutations and psychological changes that sometimes eliminated useful capabilities while enhancing others in ways that made affected individuals difficult to integrate into existing operational frameworks. The Legion's leadership struggled to balance the benefits of their enhanced capabilities against the risks posed by uncontrolled corruption. The integration with other chaos forces provided opportunities for learning and development that accelerated the Emperor's children's transformation, while introducing new complications and challenges. Cooperation with daemon entities required the development of communication protocols and operational procedures that would have been impossible under Imperial doctrine. Alliance with other traitor legions necessitated negotiations and compromises that sometimes conflicted with the Emperor's children's own evolving priorities and aesthetic preferences. These relationships were essential for their survival but often created tensions that threatened their internal unity. The beginning of their endless pursuit of sensation that would characterize their existence for millennia to come became apparent in the immediate aftermath of their fall, as individual Marines and entire companies began displaying compulsive behaviors that interfered with traditional military discipline and effectiveness. The same perfectionist drive that had once motivated genuine achievement now compelled them toward increasingly exotic and dangerous experiences that served no practical purpose beyond their own gratification. This transition from purpose-driven activity to sensation-seeking behavior represented a fundamental change in their nature that would have profound long-term consequences. Reactions from other traitor legions to the Emperor's children's rapid and dramatic transformation ranged from admiration to concern to outright disgust, depending on their own philosophical orientations and practical needs. The World Eaters appreciated their enthusiasm for violence and their willingness to embrace extreme methods, while the Iron Warriors found their increasing focus on aesthetic considerations to be a distraction from practical military objectives. The Word-Bearers viewed their transformation as validation of Chaos's power to elevate human potential, while the Night Lords saw them as competition in the field of psychological warfare and terror tactics. The formation of new command structures reflected the Emperor's children's need to accommodate their changed nature, while maintaining sufficient organization to function as a military force. Traditional imperial hierarchies based on rank and experience were modified to incorporate merit systems that rewarded innovation in the pursuit of intense experience and aesthetic achievement. Leadership positions were increasingly filled by Marines who demonstrated creativity in developing new methods of achieving transcendent sensation rather than those with conventional military expertise. These changes created more flexible but less predictable organizational structures. The psychological adaptation required to function in their new reality, as enemies of everything they had once served, proved more challenging for some members of the Legion than others, creating internal divisions that sometimes erupted into violence. Veterans who retained strong emotional connections to their previous identity struggled to reconcile their new allegiances with their memories of honorable service, while newer members who had undergone less conditioning in Imperial doctrine adapted more readily to their changed circumstances. These differences created factional tensions that the Legion's leadership was forced to manage through increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation and control. The technological legacy of the pre-fall Emperor's children continued to influence the development of Chaos Space Marine culture long after their transformation, as their innovations in weapons design, armor modification, and tactical equipment became templates that other traitor forces sought to emulate and improve upon. The sophisticated enhancement procedures they had developed for achieving perfect aesthetic and functional balance in their war gear were adapted by other legions, though few possessed the cultural refinement necessary to achieve the same level of artistic excellence. Their approach to warfare as an art form, while corrupted in its application, provided a framework that influenced how many chaos forces approached the relationship between effectiveness and aesthetic satisfaction. The cultural impact of their fall rippled throughout the broader traitor movement, as their example demonstrated both the possibilities and dangers inherent in pursuing transcendence through chaos worship. Other legions studied their transformation with fascination and horror, using their experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining focus on practical objectives rather than becoming lost in the pursuit of abstract perfection. Yet many also found inspiration in their complete commitment to their chosen path and their willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of their evolving understanding of excellence and achievement. The ongoing conflicts created by their transformation established patterns of warfare that would persist throughout the Long War, as the Emperor's Children's unique approach to combat created tactical and strategic challenges that Imperial forces struggled to counter effectively. Their integration of psychological warfare, aesthetic terrorism, and conventional military operations created a synthesis that was particularly effective against populations with sophisticated cultural backgrounds. Imperial commanders found that traditional defensive strategies often proved inadequate against enemies who viewed military operations as opportunities for artistic expression rather than simple conquest. Hidden survivors from the original Legion created complex legacy issues that would influence Imperial policy and Astartes doctrine for millennia to come. Small groups of loyalist Emperor's children, who had escaped the purges on Istvan III, carried with them both knowledge of their legion's original capabilities and traumatic understanding of how those capabilities could be corrupted and perverted. These survivors provided valuable intelligence about traitor tactics and motivations, but their psychological condition often made them unreliable witnesses whose accounts were dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy rather than accurate reports of the horrors they had witnessed. The evolution toward their 41st millennium state began immediately following their fall, and continued through a process of gradual degradation that saw each generation become more extreme and less connected to their original nature than the previous one. The pursuit of perfect sensation that had initially seemed like an enhancement to their capabilities became an addiction that consumed ever greater portions of their attention and resources. What had begun as sophisticated appreciation for aesthetic excellence devolved into crude hedonism that bore no resemblance to their former cultural sophistication, though individual Marines retained enough of their original capabilities to remain dangerous opponents. The influence on Chaos Space Marine culture extended far beyond their own Legion, as their example provided a model for how traditional military organizations could be transformed to serve the Dark Gods while maintaining sufficient cohesion to function as effective fighting forces. Their integration of ritualistic practices into operational procedures, their development of leadership structures based on charismatic authority rather than formal rank, and their approach to recruitment and training that emphasized psychological conditioning over traditional military discipline became templates that influenced many other traitor organizations. Their role in the broader heresy established precedents for cooperation between chaos forces that would prove essential during the Long War, as their experience demonstrated both the benefits and limitations of alliance between groups with fundamentally different priorities and methods. The Emperor's Children's willingness to subordinate their own aesthetic preferences to achieve shared objectives when necessary provided a model for how traitor forces could work together despite philosophical differences. Their diplomatic skills, refined through centuries of cultural exchange during the Great Crusade, made them valuable intermediaries between more hostile factions. The development of their patrons' influence through their service established Slaanesh as a major power within the Chaos Pantheon, and demonstrated the effectiveness of corruption through the promise of transcendence rather than simple domination. The Emperor's Children's fall provided Slaanesh with a powerful military force and a template for corrupting other elite units through appeal to their pride and ambition. Their example showed how even the most disciplined and noble warriors could be led astray through careful manipulation of their highest aspirations and deepest fears. The seeds of their future extremes were planted during this period, through the establishment of practices and beliefs that contained within them the potential for unlimited escalation. The pursuit of perfect experience created a framework that demanded constant innovation and intensification to maintain satisfaction, ensuring that the Legion would continue evolving in increasingly extreme directions. The integration of their identity with their achievements created psychological vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to manipulation by any influence that promised greater accomplishments or more intense experiences. The path that led to their current degradation was established through a series of philosophical and practical decisions that seemed reasonable within their corrupted framework, but collectively created momentum toward ever greater extremes of excess and depravity. Each step away from their original nature made the next step seem smaller and more acceptable, creating a cascade effect that would ultimately transform them from noble warriors into creatures that bore no resemblance to their former selves. Their tragedy lay not in any single moment of corruption, but in the gradual erosion of everything that had once made them great. Modern archaeological discoveries about the pre-fall emperor's children continue to emerge from forgotten battlefields and abandoned fortress monasteries, providing tantalizing glimpses of what the Third Legion achieved during their golden age, and raising disturbing questions about how such perfection could have been so completely corrupted. Recent excavations on Chemos have uncovered artworks and technical innovations that exceed current imperial capabilities, demonstrating that the fallen legion's achievements were genuine rather than mere propaganda or myth. These discoveries force uncomfortable comparisons between the transcendent excellence they once achieved and the degraded state to which they have fallen. The influence of their original nature on current events manifests in subtle but significant ways throughout the Imperium, as their example continues to serve as both inspiration and warning for contemporary military forces. Space Marine chapters study their pre-fall tactics and organizational methods, while implementing strict safeguards against the pride and perfectionism that enabled their corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus examines their technological innovations while carefully avoiding the aesthetic philosophy that transformed practical tools into objects of obsessive devotion. Imperial cultural policies reflect hard-learned lessons about the dangers of pursuing excellence without maintaining connection to fundamental moral principles. What their story reveals about the nature of chaos corruption provides crucial insights for understanding how the Dark Gods operate, and why even the most noble and dedicated servants of the Emperor remain vulnerable to their influence. The Emperor's children's fall demonstrates that corruption does not always announce itself through obvious moral compromise, but often masquerades as the fulfillment of legitimate aspirations. Their example shows how pride, ambition, and the pursuit of perfection can be systematically perverted to serve malevolent purposes while maintaining the appearance of righteousness and nobility. The connections between their story and ongoing narratives about perfection and fall in the 41st millennium create a framework for understanding contemporary threats facing the Imperium. Their example illuminates the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that make elite forces susceptible to corruption, providing insight into why the most capable and accomplished individuals often prove most vulnerable to chaos influence. The patterns established by their fall continue to repeat themselves across the galaxy, as new generations of warriors and leaders face similar temptations and make similar choices with predictably tragic results. The eternal warning their transformation represents resonates throughout Imperial doctrine and culture, serving as a cautionary tale about the limits of human achievement and the importance of maintaining proper perspective on the relationship between excellence and duty. Their story demonstrates that no amount of capability or achievement can substitute for fundamental moral grounding, and that the pursuit of perfection without connection to absolute truth inevitably leads to corruption and damnation. This lesson influences everything from recruitment policies for elite units to educational curricula in Imperial institutions. Archaeological evidence of their former glory serves as both inspiration and mourning for what might have been, providing concrete proof that human potential can indeed reach transcendent heights while simultaneously demonstrating how easily such achievements can be lost. Museums throughout the Imperium display artifacts from their golden age alongside exhibits documenting their fall, creating powerful visual narratives about the trajectory from achievement to corruption. These displays serve educational purposes while also functioning as memorials to a lost golden age when humanity's finest warriors embodied the highest aspirations of the species. Lessons for current Imperial forces derived from their example emphasize the importance of maintaining institutional safeguards against the pride and isolation that made the Emperor's children vulnerable to corruption. Modern military doctrine incorporates specific provisions designed to prevent the concentration of cultural authority in elite units, and to ensure that all forces remain connected to broader imperial society rather than developing separate identities. Training programs include extensive conditioning designed to inoculate warriors against the specific types of appeals that proved effective in corrupting the Third Legion. The nature of chaos corruption as revealed through their transformation provides strategic intelligence that influences how Imperial forces approach counterinsurgency operations and defensive measures against traitor space marines. Understanding the psychological and spiritual mechanisms that enabled their fall allows Imperial commanders to identify similar vulnerabilities in their own forces and implement preventive measures. Their example also provides insight into traitor capabilities and motivations that proves valuable in developing tactics for combating chaos forces in the field. Why their story matters in the 41st millennium extends beyond its historical significance to encompass its ongoing relevance as a lens for understanding contemporary challenges facing the Imperium. Their fall illuminates the eternal struggle between human aspiration and human limitation, demonstrating both the heights that can be achieved through dedication and excellence, and the depths to which such achievements can fall when disconnected from proper moral foundation. Their legacy serves as a constant reminder that in a galaxy where gods of excess wait to corrupt the pure, vigilance and humility remain essential virtues for all who serve the Emperor. The tragedy of what they could have been provides perhaps the most poignant aspect of their story, as it demonstrates that their fall was not inevitable, but resulted from specific choices and circumstances that could have been different. The Emperor's children before chaos represent a lost future for humanity, a path toward transcendence and perfection that was abandoned in favor of corruption and excess. Their story serves as an eternal reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the most perfect creations of the Emperor's vision can be led astray when pride and the pursuit of sensation become ends in themselves, transforming noble aspirations into the instruments of damnation and ensuring that their legacy echoes through the millennia as both achievement and warning for all who would follow in their footsteps.